First of all, wonderful panel here. It's pretty hard to go last, but I'm going to do my best. I think I'm going to kind of come as the last batter here and go through more as a research practitioner and just try to lend you some of my thoughts on some pretty detailed places where I think we should go. But I want to thank everybody. Some of what I prepared actually is similar, so it's already been said, and that makes my job actually easier. So that's me. So some questions of interest, and I did the animation here because it was so much fun. So, there are a lot of questions that we're all thinking about here. Levels of spending and funding in aggregate. How does funding and/or spending vary across various dimensions, schools and districts, grade levels, categories of student need? How are educational dollars being spent? Are they being spent wisely? What's the cost effectiveness? What's the benefit cost? That is a rate of return. For every dollar we spend, how much are we getting back? How much should we be dedicating to public education? How should this funding be distributed? And invariably, you're going to come down to two concepts here, efficiency and equity. Okay? So that's what at least I have on my mind. I think everybody has it on their mind, whether they explicitly acknowledge it or not. So that being said, we do a lot of thinking, but I think that there are a lot of places where we could improve our practice. So first of all, you have to have data that you can depend on, okay? Secondly, the analytical approaches that we come up with should be credible and capable of providing meaningful results that can inform policy. And then finally, I already did a great job talking about communication. You have to convey research results so they're both understandable and actionable. So like I said, there's overlap. We didn't set this up ahead of time. No collusion here. The bottom line is having data and research that are both consistent and credible is essential to making an impact. And this is my little graphical thing here. If you have inconsistent data methods that are being used to collect your data and inconsistent research approaches, your communication is already going to be undermined, and you're going to get people that are pretty savvy with some question marks. You're going to get some people that are just dumbfounded. That's that kind of crazy icon. And then you're at the end of the day, you're just still going to have a question mark. What are we doing with this money in terms of distribution and use? An example of how we can evaluate data quality, and I want to go down to the school level data because that's the hot topic right now. I mean, we're all expecting, I think there are about 13 states right now that are currently posting school level data in some fashion, and supposedly all states are supposed to be there. So, and that the New York example was really, really interesting, actually. And another good site, I sat through a webinar that Marguerite Rosa gave a while back, maybe 2 weeks ago, and Boston's site is really, really incredible. So what we did for a study about 3 years ago, and it was a U.S. Department of Education study supported by PPSS, was to check the quality of school level data. So here are some checks that we did with school level data. We went to 9 sites across the country, and we tried to check the data. When I say we, Drew Atchison is back there, Stephanie Stullick was a co-author, Bruce, I think I'm on that one. I think you're on that one. I can't even remember. So it was a while ago. But we looked at the comprehensiveness of the data, right? And this is really trying to determine how much of the operational expenditure could we attribute to the school level, right? And that is, what did they attribute, that is they being their accountability system, attribute to the school level, and what could be allocated through some sort of mechanism as well, and how did they do that? Accuracy is really the precision with which the allocated spending really measured what was hitting the school level. And then we also looked at consistency. And consistency is really important in terms of our districts using the same method, or states, I put states, districts, and schools as a more general concept, are they following the same types of procedures to collect and process their data? So we checked this, and here are some useful references that we've done this not only for the U.S. Department of Education study, but also we did a charter spending study for the state of Maryland where we developed a statewide database with every school, and we came up with the most accurate measures of school level spending we could. And we did a smaller study in California, which was only two CMOs operating in Oakland and LAUSD. So I'm going to fly through this. Another example of how we can improve research is really commit to using metrics that measure items of interest, such as equity, with sufficient rigor. Okay, we've already heard about what I would call cost factors. So we should always, whenever possible, we should try to control for those factors that are outside of the control of a district or school that we know affect costs. Okay, and this comes in really three flavors: student needs, things like student poverty, English learners, special education, scale of operations, how large or small, and I'll load in with the scale of operations, degree of rurality, okay? And then geographic variation in input prices. Here's an example where we did a comparison of the charter and traditional schools in California, and we looked at the descriptive statistics in terms of the student needs, and there were different average needs in the charter and the traditional sector. So this warranted really a conditional analysis. That is, we had to use regression analysis to try to control for these factors. I'm not going to bore you with these scatter plots because I'm with Bruce. We love scatter plots, but this is basically telling you that there is some systematic difference between the charters and the traditional schools. What I will bore you with here is the per pupil dollar figures that we have coming from an unconditional analysis, just basically comparing them, and then from a conditional analysis, and how do things change. So the darker plots here for each year show you the per pupil spending for the traditional schools on average, and then the lighter blue in each year show you for Aspire charter schools and Green Dot charter schools in both Los Angeles and Oakland. Now, this is the unconditional analysis. What it's showing here is that the charter schools seem to be spending less than the traditional schools. However, we haven't accounted for any of the perhaps confounding factors, these student needs. Once we control for these, things change a lot. So spending becomes much more equivalent, and in some cases, I'll just point to Aspire in LAUSD, spending on Aspire schools in LAUSD is actually higher than traditional schools, and you wouldn't come to this conclusion if you didn't do a slightly more rigorous analysis. And these analyses are pretty commonplace today to control for these factors. So it's not too hard. We did another type of analysis, which was an as-if analysis that I think is also a good way to go about doing these spending comparisons. And I'll just say what we did is we isolated the traditional schools and ran the same regression analysis, and then we predicted how charter schools would fare under the traditional setting. And then we compared those predicted charter schools as if they were traditional to what charter schools actually spent. And what you see is that, here we found that what was actually spent on charter schools was actually more than what we would predict would be spent on them if they were treated like they were a traditional school. So kind of neat analysis. I'm going to fly through the rest of this. We did something very similar in Maryland, but the database we had in Maryland, it was a much larger study, right? We literally did the population of schools in the state of Maryland. We were very lucky with the data that we were able to get our hands on there to build this database. So here's an unconditional, and the research question in Maryland was really how does charter school spending compare to traditional school spending, because in their statute, charter schools must be commensurately, that's the buzzword there, the key word, must be commensurately funded with their within district traditional counterparts, okay? So if we look at this right here, There are 5 districts in Maryland that had charter schools, and these are average per pupil spending in traditionals and charters, unconditional, just straight averages. And what we see is that in 3 of these districts, the charter school spending was larger than the traditional school spending, and we have in 2 districts we found the opposite. If we condition this stuff, we find a different story. Okay? Here we really find that really 4 out of the 5, and the real action is Baltimore City. They have by far the largest share of charter schools in the state. The actual expense on charter schools was more than we predicted they would get if they were treated like a traditional school. So these are just simple analyses that I think are important to try to run. Now, I want to just move to something else. This is sort of my last point here. We should really agree on more meaningful measures of equity. And Bruce already went into this, and we've talked about this quite a bit. You know, these coefficients of variation and restricted ranges and wealth neutrality, these are older measures of equity, and there's some problems with them. I mean, first of all, if you're talking about wealth neutrality, that's measuring something very, very different from these other things. I mean, you're talking about equity from a taxpayer point of view as opposed to from a student point of view. The other thing is that there, you know, if you're talking about coefficient of variation, it's really just blind to what underlies that variation. It's just talking about how compressed a distribution really is. And there are good reasons for variation in funding, really good reasons. That is, if we truly believe, you know, in a concept of equity that students with higher needs are going to require more supports and therefore more funding, then we want to see some equity. We want to see that, or some variation in funding, and we want to see progressive funding, right? So, I don't like these older measures that are more or less blind and don't really get at the underlying factors that drive the variation. And then unsurprisingly, a lot of these measures, as you saw with Bruce's stuff, are not consistent with one another. So I think we have to agree, and we have kind of gravitated towards what I would call an implicit weight measure. All right? And I would argue that weights should necessarily control for common factors. In sort of a multiple regression setting. And I know that a lot of the indices that we've seen up here correlate nicely with Bruce's there, which does use multiple factors, I believe, underlying all of it. But there's another reason why you'd want to isolate, say, the variation attributable to EL students as opposed to impoverished students as opposed to special ed is huge, right? And that is, we have funding policies that create funding adjustments for each of these factors, right? And it would be interesting to see how those policies play out empirically. And if you just do it by one factor alone, like poverty, it's much easier to just explain that one factor, and it might be correlated with EL. But as I'm going to show you 2 more slides, it can paint a rosier picture than it should.
Okay, you have 30 seconds.
30 seconds? Sounds good. So I was going to say avoid slightly conditional analysis where only one factor is controlled for. And I would also say try to decompose the pots of funding that you have. So we went into that a little bit where you isolate just state and local. Whenever possible, I would try to also isolate the unrestricted funding from the restricted, because restricted funding by its nature is always going to be progressively distributed. So that will make your pictures rosy. This is just a graphic example of an implicit weight calculation, very easy. Here is our Maryland data, okay? This is statewide, using school level data statewide, and without controls, we came up with an implicit weight of 26.3%. That's basically saying that the average student in poverty has about 26% more spent on average than the student who's not in poverty. With controls, that goes down to 11.9%. Now, in relative terms, there's a very, very big difference between those two, okay? Last slide, I promise. Thank you for your patience. I'm about to get the crook here. This is just in Baltimore City, okay? So, in Baltimore City, our unconditional implicit weight analysis is about 20%. With controls, it goes down to almost being flat. Okay. Now, if you really provide what I would call that slightly conditional analysis, you're going to greatly overestimate the progressivity for a lot of reasons, because baked into those slightly conditional numbers are the effects of EL, and to the extent that special ed might be correlated with poverty.
Special ed's a big one there.
Yeah, you know, so I just warn against this, and it's always easier to do just one factor and to explain one factor, but I think the onus is on us, and we have to do a better job at simplifying how we do the more rigorous analysis. So that's it.
Great, thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry to rush you.
No worries.